This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
Maybe we can start off by introducing you, who you are. Maybe you could tell a little bit about your background and maybe what brought you to the things that you discuss on your, like, for instance, your Instagram and the things that you write about and the things that you podcast about. So maybe we can start there.
First, thank you for having me on, of course. So I'm Ada, and I basically write and podcast and sort of create content in relation to pushing back against a lot of harmful narratives that we've seen, spread over a couple of years in the UK and also in the US. In relation to race, identity, race relations, and so on. And basically, I am a person that has always been sort of a contrarian. I've always had that contrarian spirit in me, and not in the sense of, rebelling just for rebelling's sake, but I would sort of pin it to curiosity and trying to understand, a lot more that's sort of being presented to you. And when actually started before the 2020 sort of riots and the George Floyd stuff, which was also sort of over here in the UK in terms of, the conversation around that. And it was kind of building up to that, especially when you had sort of the marriage of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. And there was a lot of stuff being, put out there in terms of, oppression, and in terms of, if you had sort of dark skin or if you weren't white, that was sort of the code at that time, then, it was sort of, inevitable for you to kind of suffer, in whatever space you found yourself in, even if it was sort of the highest spaces in the land, so to speak. And I just found that at odds with, not just my reality, but just with common sense, and I was really annoyed with the one-sidedness of things, right? And that's basically when I started pushing back and speaking and creating content, and the rest is history, really.
Well, you're based in London now, but you didn't grow up in London. You grew up in Africa. Maybe you could tell a little bit about how those two contexts differed culturally, as far as race or as far as just life in general, and maybe talk about why you came to London and what culture shock or whatever you experienced once you were there. Maybe things were better in some ways and maybe things were worse.
Exactly. So the first cultural shock was the freezing cold, of course. So, as soon as I stepped off the plane and, I remember the first time I saw smoke coming out of someone's mouth and they weren't smoking, and that was just like, what fantasy land am I in? It was just so bizarre. So I was born in Nigeria, and I grew up there as well, and sort of all my family is there, and my formative years were spent there. And there I was always, I wouldn't even say taught explicitly, because I just saw that, in the examples of my immediate and extended family. You know, that notion of sheer hard work, just hard grifting, hard work, and that resourcefulness in terms of there was no excuse, right? There was no excuse to achieving, you know, be it in academically or professionally, in business, commercially. So I saw that around me. And we came to the UK because my dad was actually born in Wales, in Cardiff. So we've always had that kind of links in the UK. My grandfather, you know, came here as well just to do some teaching, because my grandfather was a professor. So he came to do some teaching in some of the colleges here. So, you know, going back to that, doing what needs to be done, right, in terms of achieving success in any area of your life. So that's what I was always surrounded with. So when I came here at the age of 10, it was different because at that time, obviously, I was younger, so none of this race talk was so explicit. But I did experience moments where I was told, you know, on many occasions that, you know, I was sort of weird for a Black person or something like that, because my mannerisms were sort of different. The way I spoke was different. My interests and my hobbies and the things that I liked, you know, were different. And, you know, when you leave a country that's predominantly Black, like 99% Black, and then you enter a culture where there is that difference, and it was kind of weird for people to kind of realize that there were differences or there were variations in how to be so-called Black. So that's what I encountered, you know, when I came here, and it was rather odd to me, sort of being told that I was a Black. It didn't make sense, right? So yeah, I was exposed to this identity of Blackness when I came here in relation to that, and you know, and until sort of my going into college and university, you know, there were different times where either it was questioned or there was this kind of identity crisis of, well, what does that actually mean to be Black if it's not just, you know, your ethnicity or your skin color? What is this ideological sort of additions to being Black? And I could never reconcile with that.
Mm-hmm. Did you have?
No, I have many questions, but
Okay.
go ahead.
What were there an experience or a series of experiences that brought you to a place where you actually wanted to speak out about this stuff?
Yeah, so publicly, yes, it was sort of that build up, but definitely leading up to that, there were so many moments where I had frictions with different people, you know, in terms of what I believed and what I didn't believe, and or as trivial as things that I just enjoyed. So like I said, going back to that, well, do you know that you're a Black person? Why do you like this? Or
Yeah.
why do you think that? Or why don't you think this? You know, it was sort of bubbling underneath of, you know, so many questions and a lot of confusion about that. And that's what prompted me to sort of give my opinion publicly, like I said, in 2020, first in relation to Meghan Markle, because it was just, you know, there was just that one-sidedness of, you know, oppression and, you know, Black victimhood. And that was what I'd been hearing my whole life. And I basically just got sick of it, you know, and I just gave my opinion publicly about it, not for anything, but just to give my opinion, because that's, you know, one of the things I value most, being able to speak your mind and being able to think freely and express freely. And that's another problem that I found was prevalent in this so-called quote unquote Black community. There was always that pushback, you know, when you gave an opinion that seemed to deviate from the expectations of what was in line with the so-called Black identity. And I don't mind criticisms. I don't mind, you know, pushback. I don't mind people having a problem with what you think or what you say. But the biggest problem I find when you're a Black person is that that's always linked back to you being Black.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's not like, let's say, a white person and they give an opinion and it's just, well, you're just stupid, aren't you? Or that's a dumb opinion. But for
Exactly.
a Black person, there's that extra layer of, well, you're stupid as a Black person. You know, I gave an opinion recently about how it shouldn't be a shameful thing to say that you are proud to be British if you're a so-called ethnic minority. And that was what I had, you know, as a Black person, how can you say that? Well, why can't it be just as a human being living in this country like everyone else? And I needed to break out of that box of, well, this is what I'm meant to think just because I have, you know, darker skin.
I love it. I want to ask you about what your thoughts about maths being considered racist, because this is a discussion that is now happening in the United States. What are your thoughts about this?
I think it's so sad that it's funny, if that makes sense. It's just when
Totally.
I hear things like that, my heart actually breaks. Yeah, my heart completely breaks. And, you know, I don't want to be melodramatic, but that is how people should feel when they hear things like this, especially Black people. Because number one, that is racist in itself. Even as an African that came from a country where we do math as well, right? We do math, we do science. So when I hear things like, you know, test scores are racist, or, you know, objectivity, or, you know, having this specific way of finding answers is racist, I always think, do these people know what we do in Africa or not? So without them understanding, they are being racist themselves, right? And it's, you're almost creating this idea that we cannot compete by the rules. You know, I was once listening to a gentleman talk about tests being racist, and he said, well, it isn't fair, the kind of wording that is put in these tests, right? Because Black people, they're not exposed to this kind of language.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gave even such a stupid example. I think said, oh, for example, a test question says that, you know, Ben is elated. And he said, well, Black people don't know what elated means. And I was just like, do people understand what they're saying about their so-called group by purporting these lies? You know, for example, Asians and Chinese people, most of them, English is their second language.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they're able to handle these tests so well. So why is it that Black people, most who are born, or more of us are born in these countries or are more exposed to this language, why do we need to be, you know, sort of put aside, or why do these separate rules have to apply to us? So is this kind of separatist thinking for some reason when it comes to Black people, that we're not able to follow the same rules and guidelines and, you know, patterns or whatever as any other group, you know? And yeah, it will always cause more harm to the group that you're so-called trying to help and advocate for.
Yeah, I see that. I'm in academics right now. I'm in the process of getting my bachelor's degree in psychology. And so I deal with a lot of really, I mean, to me, I consider them inversions and really kind of backward thinking, just in terms of equity and what equity means. And I think this idea that equal opportunity really across the board is going to equal outcome is absurd, because that's not really how life works. What you're saying is that what we have to do is prop people up and not really give them the opportunity to use their own moxie or their own ability because they are disadvantaged in some regard. So I think it's this nerfing of the world that I really take umbrage with because I don't think it works.
It doesn't work. And if I'm being honest with you, if that was just the case, I might not even mind. So you mentioned sort of propping up groups. I may not even mind as much. But what I'm seeing now as well is that it's not just propping up some groups, it's actually putting down other groups because of that, right?
Yeah.
So in order for your group to rise up, then we need to actually discriminate, right? That Kendi kind of thinking past to be able to get rid of discrimination, we have to engage in discrimination. And that's not even just in relation to the racial stuff. Even if you look in terms of the gender and things like that, it's all, and radical feminism, it's in terms of sort of demoting the so-called dominant group instead of, as what, you know, Tony Sewell, who's an academic here, who he was commissioned to sort of, you know, explore the racial disparities in the UK and why these came about. And he said the same thing. And he sort of runs a charity that helps young Black boys get into the STEM fields, you know, in terms of tapping into their talents and not tapping into their victimhood. So it's just, you know, an inspirational person here. And he said that. He said it's not about putting aside, you know, a group that you think is the so-called dominant group. You have to see what benefits all, because we are all humans, right? So there doesn't need to be this, you know, like you mentioned, this kind of separate, you know, rules or practices just because people look different. It's actually anti-human, I think. This quest to completely equalize everyone. It's against human nature. That nothing good will come from that.
Yeah, and it's kind of ironic that the result that a lot of these things end up having is not bringing people to an equal place. It's subdividing people, and as you said, raising some up, lowering some others, demonizing some, deifying others. I like what Jonathan Haidt has to say about the two different types of identity politics: common humanity and common enemy. And I think what we see in general is a lot of common enemy politics, which only goes further to sort of divide and conquer in, for the most, you know, silly, arbitrary characteristics. So yeah, Jonathan Haidt has a lot of great things to say about that. But yeah, identity politics, yeah, it's just taking these flimsy characteristics that we have and using that to identify the totality of our beings. And I think that's so insulting in a way and debasing. It's simplifying human beings to their characteristics, and it has nothing to do with their insights, their characters, or their motivations.
Yeah.
Anything you want to take it from there?
So what are your thoughts on, kind of along the same lines, what are your thoughts on quotas?
So if quotas are kind of a forced thing, I think. Now, that is not to say that anyone that, you know, benefits of the quota system per se is there just because of that, and they don't have, you know, the skills or the training, the experience or the qualifications, you know, to do that certain task or job. So that's another thing, I think, when you're trying to push back against certain things, that it gets a bit lost as well. But I think quota systems aren't helpful, in my opinion. If you, for a couple of reasons, but one that actually probably isn't touched on a lot is it actually puts an unnecessary pressure on the person that has been, you know, given that advantage or given that, you know, opportunity because of, you know, the color of their skin or the gender, and especially if they're aware of that, because you're not going in there based on purely on your merit, right, or what you've done. There is this extra thing that has been given to you, and the proof is in the pudding. We see that, especially actually more in the United States, and a lot of Black people that have, gone into certain institutions, universities, colleges on the back of affirmative action. They haven't done as well as those maybe who haven't, and they have, the dropout rates are very high. So we've seen that it actually doesn't work, and that's why the ruling, overturning the affirmative action, policy is a good thing, contrary to what many people have said, because now you can compete, and we can compete. There's nothing that says we cannot compete, right? So quota systems, I think, as I mentioned, it's ineffective. If you feel that, certain people, there's always this talk of, well, we don't have this X amount of this group from, in this space. Well, there's probably other questions to ask, or there's probably other things that we can look at, apart from, well, let's just pick people based on their superficial characteristics anyway, right? If you find, like they found here in the UK, that in certain South Asian communities, the women, right, are underrepresented in the workforce. Well, it's very easy to jump on the fact that the system is rigged or racism is the problem. But how about we take a look at culture, right? How are the cultural patterns different to other groups where maybe women are equally represented, or even in some cases overrepresented? And it's not racist or xenophobic to ask that question. What are the cultural patterns? Is there a certain belief system that says that actually perhaps women are better, in the home, whether you think that's right or not, but maybe that actually exists there. But I feel that we don't look at that. And that's why we enforce these quota systems, because we just think it's society's fault. It's the superstructure of, or the structural system, blah, blah, blah. And then we don't actually ask other questions. So.
When you and your family first moved to London, did you feel like you were, like, as far as people seeing you and hearing you speak, the categories that you were getting put under, was it more about your race, or was it more about you being an immigrant from Nigeria? Or was it a little bit of both of those?
It was both. So when I was told by peers, so trivially, it was my ethnicity. So if I was told that I was weird for a Black girl, then it was like, oh, well, it's because she's an African Black girl. So in that sense. But in terms of the general society, what was, more salient was my racial identity per se, which obviously was very odd to me anyway, because I was never, ever described as a Black girl in Nigeria, like just never. It just never comes out, right? Even when you overhear conversations about global politics, because obviously the UK and Nigeria, a big connection there. I don't hear that kind of talk, right? You say British and you say Nigerian. It's based on ethnicity, which I think is, a better indication of someone's identity than their racial identity. So yeah, it was depending on the circle I was in, whether I would be seen racially or by my ethnicity.
Well, that leads me to a question. You're a very beautiful woman, and I wonder if your beauty somehow is a leg up, or somehow gives you more opportunities because you're attractive. Do you think that has influenced your experience in the UK? Not necessarily comparing or contrasting with Nigeria, because I'm sure there are many beautiful.
So the first time. Sorry, finish.
No, I was just saying that there's probably many beautiful women in Nigeria. So I would say you could be considered maybe more special because you're in the United Kingdom compared to being in Nigeria. But overall, would you say that your experience was different in the UK because you're attractive?
So I wouldn't have known how my experience would have been in Nigeria. I can guess that it would have still been good, but that's more based on my familial connections,
Mm.
and the history that my family has, like in our villages and stuff. Remember, like I said, I was born in Nigeria, but I came here and I stayed here for like a decade before I went back. And I remember even just going back after that decade, and the person at the airport looked at my passport and they saw my name and they said, "Oh, you're so and so's granddaughter." So we had a certain level of small prestige in my like area and things like that. But here, I don't know is the answer. But the first time I thought, okay, maybe my looks may have something to do with some of the opportunities I may have had, is I went for a job when I was 18, just after university. And I just walked in for the job and he said, "No, you look good." You got the job. And I don't know whether to have been insulted by that, but I really needed the job. It was just a simple waitressing job anyway, and looks had nothing to do with it. But what I will say is that I don't know as well if it's just the looks. I think I sound so like we're talking about this, but it is an interesting point, because I think it's also how you carry yourself as well. Like, I am well cultured, I have been in these 2 countries, I'm very interested in culture in general. I learned another language, basically self-taught myself, and people can kind of sense that approachability from myself anyway. And maybe they might not have got that from a lot of, let's say, other ethnic minorities who feel that something is against them, right? And I don't have that, aura against me, that negative, "Oh, I might not get this job because I'm Black," or "I might not fit in here," because I just don't have that. And believe it, whoever's listening and maybe has never heard this before, believe me when I say people can sense when you have this kind of defensive, protective, guarded, awkward sense about you.
Absolutely.
And like I said, it's not even just to do with, your racial identity.
Mhm.
This kind of energy oozes off a person who, I would say, probably comes from this insecurity as well. When you think that you automatically won't be accepted because of this so-called identity that you've convinced yourself, or you think society has convinced you that this part of your identity isn't good enough, right? I remember one time, because I taught English on the side for a while, and I had a student who was homosexual. And at that time, I was sort of a practicing Christian, and we got talking one day, just not about, words and vocabulary, but about Christianity, and he was talking about his identity. And it was just a normal conversation. And then the next time we arranged a lesson, I don't know, he sent me like an emoji. It was like a baguette emoji, but it wasn't anything to do with anything. I didn't even think anything of it. But then I had to cancel the lesson because something else came up. And then he sent me a long paragraph saying, "Oh, I knew that you were homophobic just because we were talking about homosexuality the other day, and I sent you a baguette." I will never forget. I sent you a baguette today. And I'm thinking, what's a baguette? So if anyone knows what that emoji means, please tell me. But can you kind of see that it's like they're almost waiting for that confirmation that you didn't like them in the first place when something trivial happens?
Exactly.
And I'm saying all that to say that I've never had that. If I don't get an opportunity, if I fail at something, there is no way in hell race will even if it may have been. Do you know why? Because that doesn't help me. We just seen the Marvel's movie tank in the box office, and the director's already blaming racism. How would that director learn? How would they grow? How would they do better the next time if the issue is external? I would rather focus on what I didn't do, because that way I win, because I'll be better the next time. I can't change that person's opinion of what they think about Black people. Neither do I care or want to. All I care about is what opportunities I can really get hold of, so that I can, be well and do well in my own life. I'm not saying we shouldn't challenge when obvious things happen, but most of the time it's just this kind of subtle things that people just automatically jump, into conclusions as any isms, racism, sexism, or whatever.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's it's such an easy divide and conquer tactic to divide people up by their races or their perceived races. But I think that sometimes that can overshadow the fact that a lot of what is happening is, I think, really classism. Does that make any sense to you whatsoever?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you see,
No, go ahead, please.
sorry. Okay, so if you see even the differences within the UK, right? This is something that a lot of us, be it conservatives or those who, aren't on the left, so like myself, we are trying to find a way to push this message out more, that if we look closer, there is a lot of, disparity within these so-called groupings as well.
Yes, exactly.
And most of the time, it does come down to class, and it does come down to cultural patterns as well. We have to talk about those two things. You asked me why I speak and say the things I say, because of common sense, right? Most of my peers or my friends and my family are not people that will class themselves as oppressed, maybe politically or ideologically to join the conversation, but when they look at their lives, they will never class themselves in. They own their own homes, they own homes back home in Africa, they don't lack anything, they're in very high positional professions here in England and back home. So why? Because if, like in my country, we weren't, I didn't escape poverty from Nigeria. Like I said, we were doing well, we were doing okay. So most immigrants that come into this country, we already come within sort of that middle class, background, right? And that's why that's also reflected in the statistics. Talking about culture as well, you will see that, within the Black demographic group here in the UK, in terms of school exclusions, in terms of school achievement, in terms of income, in terms of any other, business, commerce, there's it's well known that Africans do better than those born in Britain or the Caribbeans, right? So it's not all about race. It's not all about race. And if we insist on making it all about race, the groups that these people are so bent on helping, they're harming them, because they're making it seem, that there's nothing that can be done until the system, this abstract, intangible, boogeyman of a system, until that changes, I won't change. There's nothing I can do. So yeah, that's definitely, there's literally just like one study somewhere that talks about the disparities within the minority groups. And I think that's very sad. And I think that's a deliberate thing done to keep people in these positions, because that's where political power from certain, individuals or officials come from, or goes to, shall I say.
Yeah, I think to look to a government to do the gatekeeping or to be the referee in any of these situations is a huge mistake, because I think they may be very behind the very things that are causing these divisions or encouraging these divisions in the first place. So we're kind of in an age right now where that makes it sound like it's a huge chunk of time, but I really mean most recently in the last maybe 10 years at the most, where things like transgenderism are applauded. They're encouraged. Sometimes I feel like sometimes kids are being pushed into ideas like that. But yet something like, which I think, I don't see these two things as two completely different concepts, as far as the dynamic is concerned, something like transracialism is something that is highly taboo. And I don't know what you feel about Rachel Dolezal, but
I actually wrote her name
I know you
down.
did. Yeah, and it's up there on my list of questions. But she's obviously was highly demonized. Why do you think there's such a disparity between those two concepts? And feel free to curse.
I don't think I know.
We're a curse-friendly
I don't
podcast,
really
just so you know.
Yeah. I don't really curse anyway. I don't curse on podcasts for some reason. And if when I get really passionate and I curse and someone messages me, oh my gosh, you curse. So,
okay, just getting that out there.
Yeah. But I don't think I know. But I do think it's a strange phenomenon, something that's biologically wired into you, like your sex is so changeable apparently and fluid, and you can decide it, and something that's literally made up. Literally made up. We like to talk about social constructions. That's literally something that's not biologically real, has no scientific basis, and that's the one that's meant to be so fixed, to the point that if you have a certain skin color like white, you can't even like a certain music in public, or eat a certain food, or wear a certain clothes, because you are not apparently that, you're not allowed to partake in that, right? So isn't that strange? But I don't know why that is. I don't know who is trying to sort of keep these divisions so separate, and I don't know the reason and the purpose of that, but I do find that it's odd, definitely.
Very odd.
Well, I think in Rachel Dolezal's case specifically, I think there were some issues with self-hatred and a denial of her own upbringing and a denial of her own familial structure. And I think what she attempted to do was adopt another culture and another race that she felt more comfortable with and more accepted by. What I think the challenge is, and what is so sad about that case, is not her experience, but the experience of her children. And what she has done is actually, from their perspective, ruin their lives because they are mixed race. And so now they don't necessarily fit into what they would consider a Anglo culture or a Black culture, because their mother has, for all intents and purposes, kind of hijacked their experience. So I think that's kind of an interesting example of someone who has done something that maybe, in looking backward, she would say, well, this was not a good decision for me to wear self-tanner and, perm my hair and try to identify with this specific race, because that's where like Black men were more attracted to me and I felt more comfortable in that space. So I think that there's a overarching message here that I found interesting from Black women that were saying there's no way that a white woman could ever understand the oppression or the experience of a Black woman. And I think they were more annoyed by that she was trying to say that her version of oppression is the same as a Black woman. So then it becomes this bid for who is the most oppressed.
Yeah, and I think that's problematic in itself. And I think mixed race people or biracial people, I think they struggle with that anyway, even without having a background, like Rachel Dolezal. I mean, I've seen and heard, and spoken to countless of them that feel like they always have to pick a side. right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the reason that is because we have these, like Chris said, this idea that everything has to be so distinct, you know. And if you even look at what's his name, Colin Kaepernick, and you know, there was that you know, he dissociated from his parents because it's like, well, I don't want to be seen as having to do anything with that, you know. And it happens time and time again. Even the author of I'm not talking to why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, you know, I forget her name now. And there was a chapter in the book where she had that conflict with her mom because she's mixed race or black. I think it's mixed race, if I'm not mistaken, and her mom is white. And there was that friction because, like you said, well, you can't understand me or my experience. And I find that quite disheartening because, you know, how can race just come in between, you know, that bond of a mother and child, you know, something that should transcend race. I just find it odd that your mother can't understand you. You know, she doesn't have to be you or have your skin color to understand you. And you even see this, you know, beyond parent and child relationships. You even see it with just marital relationships or, you know, in general. And that's why you have concepts like Black love, which is another problem I have, this racializing of universal concepts, right? So Black love, and if you actually look at what Black love is, it's apparently just being with someone that's Black because they can therefore understand your exact experience. And I think it's just a lie. No one can fully understand like the innermost workings of your mind anyway, but we can all relate to each other on that human level. If you can understand pain, love, hurt, rejection, disappointment, hope, joy, you can understand another freaking human being. And I don't understand this, you know, it's like we're in a special category, and I've written about this many times, the Black experience. I was watching a therapist, a Black therapist, and I've heard other Black therapists say this, that Black people need Black therapists because they need someone to understand. It's just like, if you need that and you really need that, that's fine. But let's not send out this message, because then that's what's actually, again, harming the people that need the help. Because it's like, well, this person can't help me because they're white. But I bet if you were drowning in a pool, you know, or somewhere, you're not going to care about the color of the person's skin. You know, it just seems that we pick and choose when someone is able to help us and when someone isn't. So I forgot the question, but
one of my mentors is a Ethiopian woman, and her husband is an Ethiopian man, and they live in a very conservative part of Kansas, and he at least once a week gets stopped by the police. And she said to him at one point, you know, I am so shocked by how you respond to these exchanges. Like, you never get angry, you never get upset, you never get into some shouting banter with these police officers. How is it that you're capable of handling these exchanges in the way that you do? And he said, because I have 3 sons. And what I want to teach my sons is that this is not about me being Black. It's about me as a man handling a situation, and how do I handle that situation? And that's what I want to teach my sons. I don't make it about my race, even though for that person that may be about my race. This is about my character and what type of a person I am. And it just really highlighted the fact that he understands the difference of the environment that he's in, coming from Ethiopia and being in this small town in Kansas, but the person he is the same.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like what I was saying earlier, right? It has to be, of course, as I mentioned, when something needs to be challenged, there also needs to be a way to challenge it. And we're not doing, we're doing a great disservice to our children when we think that the only way to challenge something is to, wild out and protest. There's just so many different ways. If we look at the examples of people in the past anyway, as well, even if you look at Martin Luther, if you look at Booker T. Washington, look at so many people that it was through their character who our organization is named by, after, Equiano. He was a Black African abolitionist here in the UK, intelligent, eloquent man that was able to do that, right? Without having this, feeling of, animosity or rage or victimhood or sort of particularizing every event to himself. And I feel that's what happens sometimes. There's this narrative that this is happening to you because it's you, and not because, it's just an unfortunate thing that hundreds of thousands of other people also go through. And my point is that doesn't make it right, but it does something to a person's psyche when you make it seem that the whole world just moves, deliberately just to, put them in harm's way or make them suffer. And that's what separates winners and losers, right? Isn't it funny that you have people who really went through deep, legal, in-your-face oppression, and they're able to come and say, I am a better man today. This is what I learned. This is what happened. And you have some people that, someone just looked at them a little bit funny, and that's enough for them not to go out in the world and conquer what they need to conquer.
Yeah, what you were saying earlier about how you present yourself in the world and what you project your inward to the outward really has a huge, huge role in all of this. And no matter what situation you're in, no matter what kind of human you are, what you carry around inside inevitably gets projected on the outside. And I think that element is lost on a lot of people because they just, I don't know, whether maybe that part hasn't been accentuated in their upraising, or they think their voice of their opinion is insignificant, or they just don't believe in the fact that how you carry yourself in the world and the way that you interact with it and the words you use and the tone you use really affects every single aspect of things. So I think that part is definitely underrated.
We're in an age where, in the outsourcing of responsibility, and that also includes personal responsibility.
Sure.
Especially in the Western world, as much as it's great, it's, liberal order, liberal values, enlightenment and all that, awesome. But one thing that we're seeing is the outsourcing of responsibility, whether it's outsourcing responsibility of taking care of your own children. So you have people blaming the government of certain things when it's your responsibility to raise your own child and make sure your child has a safe place, where they can thrive, right? Whenever I see a story of a young Black boy being stabbed in the UK, and I see a mother on the screen talking about because he didn't have any youth clubs to go to, that's why her son stabbed another human being. I just don't understand, okay, the boy didn't have a youth club, but he had you, right? And you don't have to be physically in the home to distill some kind of discipline and order from your child. And I just don't buy that excuse anymore. When we were here, my dad was pretty much on his own for a while, and he made it seem that I could be 10,000 miles away, and if I was even thinking about doing something wrong, his voice was in my ear. So that is a skill, I guess, nowadays, to have that kind of, that level of respect from your child, that their actions, or they believe that their actions reflect on you. But that's an aside point. So this outsourcing of personal responsibility, people are not so much interested in seeing what they can do to improve their situation, right? It's always, well, what has been done to me, right? And it's nice in a way because there's, it's comfortable for you. There's nothing expected, or there's no energy or sort of nothing that has to be extracted from you. You just stay in your place and wait for the thing to change. But there's no reward in that, you know. There's no you know, self-development, nothing. The person that loses is the person that doesn't choose that path of introspection to see how, you know, things, you know, can work out for themselves.
Yeah, I'm shocked by these events that are now coordinated and orchestrated on TikTok, and I would assume probably Snapchat, these snatch and grabs that are being orchestrated all over the United States. I don't know if this is happening in the UK necessarily, where there will be a message out like, okay, let's go to Nordstrom or let's go to Harrods if we were in England, and just maraud and steal whatever we can. So this idea of, you know, minimum effort, maximum return seems to be this kind of overall narrative. Like, we don't have to work for anything. And then it's ill-gotten gains. Then you have these things, you have all of the trappings, but you didn't earn those things. Do you think that social media is playing a role in this striving for material goods and like this lack of maybe a Christian ideal or some type of a spiritual foundation that would stop someone from stealing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people blame or sort of point to the decline of religion, particularly Christianity, and I can understand that. Like you said, especially when you don't have that at the back of your mind, that something else is, you know, watching you, as Christianity had. But I definitely think it's definitely not that. It's a combination of things, and social media has exacerbated the problem, right? And you know, we're in an age of, like I said, outsourcing of responsibility, sort of fast paced, things are easy, and like you said, there's minimum consequences. In fact, there's even justification for why you did what you did. And that's what I said about the, you know, youth club and so on. We don't put the blame where the blame needs to be put. It's always put on the government. And I get it, you know, it's always this, in a way, to try and hold the government accountable or make sure that the government is doing what it needs to be doing. But I think sometimes we just need to go back to basics, you know, family structure, right? Mm-hmm. You know, religion or spirituality, basically something higher than yourself, right? If we don't do that, then social media are just the tools, you know, for this destruction rather than, you know, the causes of it, in my opinion. So yeah, it's really sad. And I think coupled with, you know, this game of identity politics as well, where, you know, people are excused because they're in a so-called, you know, oppressed group, and it's not their fault why they behave that way. So that agency is taken from them, right? That's why laws are relaxed, you know, for certain group, or you're not allowed to say anything because, you know, that deems you as racist. Because especially in countries like the UK and US, you know, who feel like this is some kind of a way to atone for the past, you know, sins and the past atrocities that they may have done. And it's so bizarre because we can't mix these two things, right? It doesn't actually solve the problem. If anything, you're creating, you know, disorder in your own societies in the name of social justice and, you know, atonement.
I did find it interesting that these people who are involved in the Black Lives Matter organization were also involved with the transgender, we could call it an agenda, and that a lot of money was being siphoned from Black Lives Matter to these organizations, these transgender organizations. What do you think the overlap with that is?
I think, sorry, in terms of what do you mean? Sorry.
Like, why would someone that is part of the, is it just a money laundering scheme? Like they're using Black Lives Matter, like as the umbrella, like for the overall oppression of Black people. So they take this money and then they have a spouse or a partner who is part of the transgender community, or somehow they're involved in the transgender community. So they create this clinic or this safe space for transgender people. I wonder, it just seems so strange that there's any type of an overlap. Do you think it has something to do with one quote unquote oppressed group using that umbrella to basically steal money in the name of another oppressed group?
Yeah, and I don't know why people don't realize that, all this is to do with wielding political and financial power for, for different groups, right? And it's so weird that the black identity has become some kind of a benchmark, on what oppression actually is. And it's like, if you want your cause heard, then link it to Black people. We're seeing it now with the Palestine conflict in Israel, and it's being, likened to, Black oppression and things like that. We even saw cases in the UK where they're trying to do like an environmental thing called ULEZ. I'm not going to go into it, but it's just something to do with, taxing. Oh, yeah. And
15
there were
minutes
some stories, saying what exactly, and it's like, well, it's actually going to harm Black people. And there was a story about that, and even the online safety bill in the UK in terms of the government having more, access to your privacy, and it was linked to, well, because Black people experience racism. And it's like, why is it like to kind of validate, your cause, link it to Black people and you have that stamp of approval. But yeah, I saw the whole thing as quite nefarious. There's nothing fighting for, rights or whatever. But I think to, claim that it's, actually for the betterment of these people, I think it's actually false when you see that the leaders of many of these groups and the front runners, time and time again, we see them exposed as frauds. We see them exposed as not actually, doing the things. And this is not new. This is from the beginning of when, civil rights and all that started. Yes, you had, good things that came out of it, but, you had people using and misusing and abusing these causes to enrich their own pockets. And that's why I don't buy into these things. That's why I push more for individuality and that personal responsibility, because no one is going to save you, and I'm not even angry at these people that are, it makes sense, because that's what I'm saying. Yes, we should all be in it for ourselves in a way, and just do what we need to do and stop looking for things and people to save us. That's what we are saying. And these people are making bank off, actually the genuine pain and the genuine complaints of certain people, which can be tackled in different ways. I'm not saying these complaints aren't there, but there has to be, better ways to look at them.
What are your thoughts?
I absolutely loved our conversation. I'm quite impressed with her, and she's very well spoken, and felt very comfortable having these kind of complicated conversations about very complicated subjects with her. I'm just always impressed with anyone who is willing to talk about things that are current and ongoing hot button issues. So it was great.
But discuss them rationally and level-headedly, and with which she mentioned more than once, common sense. I think that's highly important. And it's easy, some would say it's easy for white people to have these conversations because we have the luxury and the intellectual freedom or whatever to ponder these things because we're not, quote unquote, in the middle of it, or we're not subject to these sorts of issues. But I think the important aspect of all of that is that they are human issues. They're not issues necessarily on people's gender or their race so much as human issues. And I think to say you can't understand my experience because you're not this, that, or the other is ridiculous. I mean, humans ideally are empathic creatures. And if you take it out of the realm of race or gender or sex or ethnicity and look at it as a human thing, as issues of dignity, issues of exclusion, issues of shame, issues of self-hate, whatever. These are things that we all experience. But instead, we divide these things into, I only feel this, and you, there's no way you can even begin to relate to that. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I grew up a white kid, but I know what exclusion is like. I know what it's like to be outcast and stuff like that. I mean, maybe not on the same in the same context or to the same extent as somebody else, but that gave me enough of a taste of it to understand what that must be like as one human to another fellow human. So I think to belittle that is to belittle our common humanity, and that's a big deal.
Well, in my experience, have seen that the people who tend to be the most kind of entrenched in this idea of entitlement are people who are not very sophisticated and who have not traveled extensively. So for me, the way I kind of reconciled my life was going outside of the United States and living for a period of time outside of the comfort or the confines of living in the American westernized culture.
Bubble.
And what I would say is for some people who just judge people based on these very, surface criteria is take yourself out of this circumstance and put yourself in another environment, and you'll see how just how these ideas are very self-serving, and that they're not necessary, that being a decent human is universal, and those things carry across borders. It's not just because you live in this country that you have privilege. It's because you have integrity or you have a certain outlook on the world that gives you more of the capacity to see someone as an individual and not in groups. And I think that's the part that I get so frustrated with some of these discussions is how can you lump an entire group of people together and say every single member of this group has privilege, every single member of this group is disenfranchised. There's such individual experiences in both circumstances that you can't paint with such a broad brush, and it's such a disservice to people to do that. And I just find that so unfortunate, and it serves another power that, it's like all you're doing is you're just reinforcing the government.
Exactly. And I think so much progress had taken place in the area of quote unquote racial relations for many decades, or at least the last few decades. And I feel like the last decade or the last 5 years in particular, we've taken a huge step back. And I'm not a part of that game. I don't feel like my mindset has taken a huge step back, but I think collectively with all of this I don't know why it can't be seen for what it is, divide and conquer. Like, it's so successful, such a highly successful campaign to divide human beings up. I think anything that people use or institutions or governments use to divide people up, I don't give a fuck as to under what category or in what way. This has no place in our common humanity, in our human experience, has no place. All of the divisions that we self-impose, I feel the same exact way about it. I find it astounding that people would impose categories and divisions based on arbitrary characteristics upon themselves willingly and feel proud of it and carry flags around about it, excluding themselves from the greater humanity. I just find that I just don't understand it. I just don't understand it. I mean, maybe I'm not saying anybody should be ashamed for being one color or sexual persuasion or anything like that, but we don't need to build an organization around it. Like, you're still a human being. You're just having one variety of human experience. And I think anything that dissolves that common humanity amongst us has no place in our world. No place.
Well, I have been examining evolutionary biology quite a bit recently. And when we look at just, human history for the past, 6 million years, it's so fascinating to see how the cycles that we have gone through and what has benefited one group has been at the expense of another group. And the kind of overarching theory or the overarching element to this is that it's always been an outside group that comes in and makes these alterations and makes these changes. So it's the church. That's the first government, is the church comes in and says, well, instead of you inheriting your land, your father's land, when he dies, now all of that land is going to go to the church. And so there's a huge land grab that happened in Europe when this was implemented. And throughout history, there have been these outside groups that have slowly eroded the family system. And it's so interesting to see how the feminist movement has played a part in that, and how the feminist movement, while it seems like, again, we are looking for equity and women want equal pay and women want equal outcomes, what that movement has done is actually erode the family system, and it's created all of these single parents. You add in the access to birth control, you add in women going out and having the ability to have multiple partners, and then they have maybe multiple children by multiple men, and you wonder why that has eroded the family structure. And what is that done? Well, it's brought in the government, and now the government is supplementing income, and the government is really involved in that structure and trying to reinforce this bifurcation of men and women. So I think all of these things are related, and it's not just a racial divide that we are seeing. It's a cultural divide. It's a sexual divide. And all of these things contribute to each other. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there is a demographic crisis that's happening, where birth rates have plummeted across the globe in different cultures and in different parts of the world. So I think this is something that we need to continue to discuss and examine and really kind of drill into, because at the rate we are going in the next 50 years, we are going to we are heading into this technocratic future where, people have robots in their homes, and that they're getting their sexual pleasure from something that is not sentient and is not, organically based. So, I think the problems that we think that we have right now will only be exacerbated if we don't continue to have these types of discussions. And I think that's why it's really powerful to have people like Ada on, because we need different points of view, and we need to be able to speak to people who have different ideologies and different perspectives. And I just think it's very powerful. I know that was a
Absolutely.
rant, but
That's okay. We're trading off. Here's my rant.
back in my day.
I think that I've heard Ada say it, and I've heard Dr. Sheena Mason say it, who we're going to have on in January, who wrote a book about racelessness and really goes into the concept of racelessness. As they have said and intimated many, many times, how do we stop racism? Well, stop teaching your children about race, period. And stop being so obsessively focused on racial issues, because really, in some sense, the ongoing tension around the subject is ironically exacerbated by obsessively focusing on it all the time. I don't consider the conversation that we had today obsessively focusing on it. I think it's a very level-headed, critical thinking, an objective viewpoint on these sorts of issues, but not definitively one way or another, but open-mindedly talking about these concepts that are, have lots of different ways of looking at them. But I think to constantly, just turn on, here's an exercise for you. Just turn on NPR, and assuming that there's not some classical radio or classical music show that's on, or one of their usual, even if it is one of their usual programs that, like This American Life or something like that, race is going to be brought up. You can count on it. Racial issues are going to be brought up, if not some left-right political bullshit. And you will begin to see how media, in particularly what I used to consider the liberal, open-minded media, are constantly seeding the metaphorical, emotional clouds of our ecosystem with these ideas that there are two groups of people. They're the oppressed and they're the oppressors, and nobody can vary from those categories. And of course, the oppressed are going to be people of a certain race and people of a certain sexual orientation. And I don't know, are women even in that category anymore? Fuck, what is a woman? But
I do want to add a caveat to that.
Okay.
That racelessness does not mean a lack of cultural or ethnic identity. So you can still be raceless and have your culture. You can still be raceless and have your ethnicity. So the things that make ethnicity and the things that make culture are food, our music, our art, and those things don't have to go away.
Exactly. Yeah, but calling somebody, lumping a group of people together because of the vaguely similar color of their skin and classifying them all as one is ridiculous, unless you're going to classify everybody as human. And then that's not ridiculous. That makes a lot of sense. So, yes, stop focusing, putting the microscope on this concept of race. And I love what Ada said about when I brought up, so why is transgenderism something that's almost encouraged these days, but transracialism is like the biggest taboo ever? She had a great comeback to that. It's interesting because, there are very obvious biological ways of differentiating gender and sex, but to take a concept like race, which is very nebulous and really just superimposed upon whatever culture or whatever society that you happen to be a part of, definition is imposed upon that, and saying that is much more taboo than pretending to be the opposite sex. Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous.
I am curious, and I wanted to touch on that, and we didn't circle back to that. I am curious to know what the statistic is in Nigeria or in overall in Africa regarding transgenderism. If this is something that is a phenomenon there, if it's a limited phenomena, I know that there are some different perspectives regarding homosexuality in Africa, but I would be really curious. Like, I know in the Middle East that the government will pay, in some countries, the government will pay for someone to have a sex change operation because it's illegal to be homosexual in certain countries. So I wonder what the perspective is regarding transgenderism.
Yeah, I would be interested to know that too. So obviously, Ada is definitely going to come on again.
Yes, it was
and
fantastic.
Yeah, and quite a few times if she's up for it. But yeah, she was great. She was fantastic. I really love her refreshing outlook and attitude, which is very common sense, and that's like my religion is common sense. I think that's what this world needs right now is common sense. Like, come on, really? This just makes sense. So thank you, Ada, for your clear-headedness and wonderful way of articulating these things that are sometimes hard to articulate.
Yeah, and I just want to thank her parents. I mean, she's such a beautiful person and so smart, and it really does speak to her family and the upbringing that she received. So I want to give a shout out to her people because I think they're probably really incredible humans and
hopefully proud of her.
Yes, I was very, very impressed at how astute and just what a great guest she was. So I look forward to many more conversations in the future.
Indeed. Hopefully you glean something positive from this. I think I'll just put the whole thing out for free instead of having like 15 or 20 minutes behind a paywall. So, yeah, feel free to reach out and let us know what you think, or if you have recommendations for more guests. And we always encourage you to reach out to our guests and let them know that you really appreciated hearing them on the Melt, and follow them on whatever their social media outlets are, and subscribe where appropriate, so on and so forth. Because all these people, we bring them to light because we feel that they could use all of our support. So yes. Anyway, the way to do that is the Melt Podcast at at protonmail.com or
hunter-muse at protonmail.com.
We appreciate. I appreciate the ability to talk. Let's see if I can summon that ability. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to this, and hopefully you are walking away with something positive from the discussion. I know that I certainly am. So thank you all for listening. Much love to the human community. More of this stuff coming. Just pay attention and hey, hit that subscribe. Ta-ta.
Yeah.